Ayan Malik never intended to uncover a global secret. At 27, he was just another data analyst working late nights in a cramped office surrounded by monitors, graphs, and half-empty coffee cups. His job was simple: detect unusual financial patterns for a private research firm that advised investment groups. But on a quiet Thursday evening, while running a routine analysis of European market movements, he noticed something that didn't make sense. A single entity, its name buried deep inside a web of coded filings, appeared repeatedly across unrelated sectors: energy grids in Germany, pharmaceutical supply lines in France, agricultural land in Spain, and even pension reserves in Italy. At first, Ayan assumed it was a coincidence or perhaps a large investment group he simply hadn't heard of. But as he dug deeper, the feeling in his stomach began to twist. This company wasn't just large. It was enormous. $7.9 trillion in assets. Enormous. Yet, when he searched for its public presence, he found almost nothing. No CEO appearances, no interviews, no press releases, no official website. It was as if the company didn't want to be known at all. Ayan expanded his search. Every new document uncovered a fresh layer of mystery. The company's structure was hidden behind hundreds of subsidiaries, each acting as a mask for the real owner. Its influence stretched across water management systems, shipping routes, telecom towers, hospitals, and national banks. It wasn't buying companies. It was buying entire systems. The deeper he went, the clearer it became. This was not a typical corporation, it was a shadow giant, silently shaping global economies without ever appearing on the world stage. Ayan's pulse quickened. He pulled up historical market charts from the past 50 years, and a chilling pattern emerged. Whenever this company moved, markets reacted, economies shifted. Governments quietly adjusted policies. Entire industries rose or fell. But the public had no idea. He presented a small portion of his findings to his manager the next morning. She stared at the documents for a long moment before quietly sliding them back to him. "Don't dig into this," she said. Some companies prefer to stay invisible. That only fueled his curiosity. Ayan spent the next week secretly gathering every trace he could find. He noticed that the company never took majority ownership. Instead, it held strategic minority stakes, just enough to influence decisions without attracting attention. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. One night, while reviewing a forgotten set of 1970s reconstruction documents, Ayan found a reference that made his heart stop. The company had ties to post-war European recovery programs. That meant it wasn't just powerful. It was old, older than any modern investment firm had a right to be. By now, Ayan wasn't just curious. He was alarmed. A corporation with $7.9 trillion in assets and no public identity wasn't just simply hiding, it was controlling. And if it could hide this much for so long, what else was it keeping in the dark? Ayan had discovered the world's most powerful company, and no one had ever heard of it. Ayan's breakthrough came from an old, dust-covered folder hidden inside a digital archive of post-World War II reconstruction documents. The folder contained only a few scanned pages, many of them barely legible. But one symbol repeated across the papers, the same symbol he had seen in the financial filings of the mysterious dollar, $7.9 trillion company. It was a faint emblem shaped like a circle divided into 4 parts, almost like a compass without directions. The image sent chills down his spine. He began tracing the emblem through different historical sources. Within hours, he uncovered hints that the company's roots stretched all the way back to 1946, when Europe lay in ruins. Cities were rubble, industries shattered, and national currencies unstable. The world was desperate for structure, leadership, and money. That's when a covert group of allied financial strategists, economists, bankers, Military advisors formed a private committee tasked with rebuilding Europe's collapsed economic systems. Officially, they called it a temporary construction alliance. Unofficially, it became the seed of the shadow giant Ion was now chasing. The idea was simple: create a financial institution with immense flexibility, free from political interference, capable of rapidly injecting capital where needed. But as documents revealed, this alliance didn't disband after Europe stabilized. Instead, it quietly evolved. With no public oversight, no elections, and no accountability, the organization began acquiring assets: energy companies, steel mills, transportation lines. Each purchase was made under a different name, forming the first layer of the company's modern shell network. By the early 1950s, the alliance realized something profound. If they controlled enough of Europe's critical industries, they wouldn't just stabilize economies, they could shape them, influence policies, guide growth, avoid the mistakes that led to global war, or so they believed. Ian read reports describing secret meetings held in war-torn bunkers, where leaders debated how much power was acceptable for a private institution acting with government-like authority. But financial momentum is hard to stop. The more industries the alliance acquired, the more nations depended on them. During the Cold War, this dependence became a strategic asset. With tensions rising between East and West, maintaining control over European infrastructure was seen as essential for security. Western governments quietly encouraged the alliance to expand, ensuring that vital industries didn't fall into Soviet-influenced interests. What started as a reconstruction fund was now an insurance policy for the Western world. By the 1970s, the alliance, now operating under its modern but still secretive name, controlled enough assets to rival small countries. But unlike other global institutions, it rejected publicity. It refused to list leadership. It published no annual reports. It operated entirely through private contracts buried deep in international law. Ian leaned back in his chair as the truth sank in. The $7.9 trillion company was not a modern phenomenon. It was a ghost from the ruins of war. It had been silently shaping Europe for nearly 8 decades, growing stronger with every crisis. And if its origin story was this deeply hidden, what else had it done? Ian's next task was to understand who ran this colossal, unseen institution. Any company managing $7.9 trillion should have a well-documented leadership structure: names, boards, executives. Yet every digital corner he searched came up empty. No public-facing CEO, no biographies, no interviews, not even a leaked email. It was as if the company operated without people. But companies don't run themselves. Late one night, after hours of scanning legal databases, Ian stumbled upon a set of private trust agreements stored in an obscure European registry. These contracts, written in archaic legal language, didn't refer to executives or directors. Instead, they referenced trustees, a term associated with wealth guardianship rather than corporate management. Ian's eyes narrowed. So this wasn't a corporation at all. It was a multi-layer trust, camouflaged beneath thousands of subsidiaries. The contracts were dated decades apart: 1962, 1978, 1991, 2005. Different eras, different economic climates, yet the structure remained unchanged. At the core was a closed circle of anonymous trustees, each identified only by a number and signature code. No real names, no public identities. But the most shocking part wasn't their anonymity, it was their power. The trust's bylaws revealed that these trustees weren't merely administrators. They had authority over national-level decisions whenever a country's financial stability intersected with the trust's assets. They could influence restructuring plans, negotiate secret bailout terms, or redirect billions with a single vote. And these votes weren't cast in boardrooms. According to the documents, decisions were made during closed teleconferences, encrypted exchanges, and occasionally in-person meetings held at undisclosed locations every few years. Ian felt a knot form in his chest. These trustees operated outside any democratic system. No elections, no accountability, no public record. They were ghosts controlling the financial arteries of entire nations. He continued reading. The contract also described an unusual rule called the Cascade Clause. If a trustee died, retired, or became incapacitated, they were replaced not by election but by nomination chosen by the remaining trustees through a confidential process. This meant the group was self-sustaining, self-selecting, and completely insulated from outside influence. Once someone entered the circle, their identity was protected for life. Then Ian found something even more troubling. Governments consulted the trust regularly. Buried correspondence revealed that finance ministers, central bank governors, and even prime ministers had sought the trust's approval or input before implementing major economic decisions. Not because they wanted to, but because failing to do so could risk destabilizing entire sectors the trust quietly controlled. To most world leaders, the trust wasn't just a company. It was the invisible hand that kept their economies from collapsing. Corporations feared it because of its influence. Governments relied on it because of its reach, and the public didn't even know it existed. Ian stared at the screen. He knew now. He wasn't investigating a business. He was uncovering a shadow government, one that operated not through politics, but through ownership. And that made it far more powerful. Ian had uncovered the trust's origins and its invisible leadership, but he still didn't know the full extent of its reach. How much did this $7.9 trillion entity actually control? And how deeply was it woven into the fabric of Europe itself? To answer that, he turned to decades of leaked investment reports, forgotten infrastructure audits, and archived government procurement records. Piece by piece, he mapped out the company's holdings until the truth formed a picture so vast and unsettling that he doubted his own research. The trust didn't merely invest in Europe. It owned Europe. The numbers were staggering. Nearly 42% of Europe's critical infrastructure had ties, direct or indirect, to the trust. Not obvious ownership, but subtle stakes placed strategically in companies that ran the backbone of society. It didn't need majority control. A 12% or 18% stake was enough, especially when combined with other silent partners who followed its lead. Ian found evidence that the trust had influence in national electricity grids across Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands, pharmaceutical supply chains in France, Belgium, and Switzerland, major hospitals and private healthcare groups in Italy, telecommunication networks, including fiber backbone routes across Eastern Europe, water management systems, especially in regions facing drought, agricultural corporations controlling vast farms in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, food distribution giants which determined prices in supermarkets. Ian realized something terrifying. Even daily essentials food, water, medicine, power were intertwined with the trust's quiet empire. Europeans went about their lives unaware that an unseen force held influence over everything from their hospital bills to the price of bread. And the trust preferred it that way. One leaked memo from a telecommunications executive revealed the strategy clearly. Control is most effective when it is invisible. Ian read cases where politicians had unknowingly supported policies aligned with the trust's interests, only to later discover that their decisions had been influenced by analysts hired indirectly through trust-funded research groups. In other instances, the trust had quietly redirected billions into industries it wanted to strengthen: renewable energy, logistics hubs, data centers, while starving outdated sectors of capital. It wasn't political manipulation. It was economic steering. The trust didn't care who occupied parliament seats or won elections. Elections came and went, but the infrastructure stayed. The supply chain stayed. The financial networks stayed. Whoever owned them ruled them silently. IN also discovered how the trust influenced public opinion without ever appearing in the media. By holding stakes in major advertising networks, digital platforms, and even some broadcast companies, it could indirectly support narratives that aligned with its long-term economic interests. Not by censoring content directly, but by shaping which industries thrived, thereby subtly guiding what stories made headlines. The realization hit IN like a punch. This wasn't a company. This was a silent empire, a force so deeply embedded in Europe that removing it would cause the continent to collapse into chaos. And now that IN understood the scale of its power, he had to decide whether he was ready to face what came next. As IN continued piecing together the trust's influence, he noticed something unusual: missing data. Entire years of financial statements, activity logs, and investment records simply vanished from the late 1990s through the early 2000s. It was as if the company had stepped out of history for a moment. No acquisitions, no major moves, no shifts in ownership patterns, just silence. And in the world of finance, silence is the loudest warning of all. IN dug deeper, using old server backups, corrupted files, and abandoned internal memos recovered from outdated government archives. Slowly, the missing puzzle pieces began to take shape. They pointed toward a crisis, a catastrophic financial event that had nearly brought down not only the trust, but half of Europe. It started around 2001. The trust, confident from decades of strategic dominance, launched an aggressive investment maneuver targeting technology infrastructure, early data networks, and global logistics systems. Believing the world was entering a new digital age, the trustees moved billions at once. But the timing was disastrous. The dot-com bubble burst. Global markets trembled. And for the first time in its life, the trust miscalculated. IN found a restricted internal message written by a trustee. We underestimated volatility. Exposure exceeds safety thresholds. Immediate intervention required. In plain terms, the trust was collapsing. If it failed, the consequences would have been catastrophic. European pension funds tied to its performance would crash. Major hospitals dependent on its backing would shut down. Energy grids would lose critical funding. Pharmaceutical supply lines would freeze. Agricultural systems would stall, triggering food shortages. The trust didn't just risk bankruptcy, it risked pulling Europe down with it. Yet no one had heard of this disaster. There were no headlines, no public warnings, no political speeches about looming economic doom. The event had been erased from the public record. IN soon discovered why. 5 European nations, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Italy, and Belgium, held a secret summit. They knew exposing the trust's failure would trigger a panic that could destabilize the entire continent. So instead of a public bailout, they chose a hidden one. Through off-the-book emergency loans, covert bond injections, and restructured credit lines disguised as infrastructure investments, they quietly pumped money into the trust, keeping it alive, but nothing comes without a price. In exchange for being saved, the trust gained unprecedented access and control. It was allowed to influence long-term national development plans, energy strategies, telecom expansions, and even the coordination of public-private partnerships. The governments justified it internally as stability oversight. In reality, they had handed the shadow giant the master key to Europe. The crisis was buried so deeply that only fragments remained, fragments IN now held in his hands. And as he looked over the evidence, a chilling thought struck him. If a company could nearly collapse Europe once, it could do it again. And next time, no one might be able to stop it. The deeper IN went, the more he felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him like a physical force. The trust wasn't a mere financial entity. It was the quiet machinery keeping Europe alive if he exposed it. Billions of dollars could vanish overnight, markets would convulse, and entire nations might lose access to vital infrastructure. Yet if he stayed silent, then a powerful, unelected, anonymous group would continue controlling the world from the shadows. Neither choice felt right. Both choices felt dangerous. Ian prepared a detailed report anyway, a comprehensive file containing 8 decades of hidden history, secret bailouts, ownership webs, and the anonymous trustees who had shaped Europe's fate. He encrypted the document, stored copies across several servers, and drafted an article that would send shockwaves across the global financial system. He planned to publish everything at midnight. But 3 hours before the deadline, as he sat alone in his apartment surrounded by papers, hard drives, and glowing monitors, his phone buzzed with an unknown encrypted message. The sender's identity was masked behind layers of digital protection, but the text was chillingly clear. "You are looking at something far larger than you understand." A second message followed. "If you reveal the trust, chaos will follow." We prevented collapse once. The world has no buffer left for a second crisis. Ian froze. His first thought was that he had been hacked. But then a third message appeared, this one containing a signature code he recognized from the trustee, contracts he had studied. It wasn't a hacker. It was someone from inside. The message continued, "We are not your enemy. We exist because the alternative is worse. If we fall, nations fall. Supply chains fall. Medical systems fall. People die. Ask yourself if you are ready to carry that weight." Ian stared at the screen. The trust wasn't threatening him. It wasn't bribing him. It was warning him. And that made it even harder to ignore. He thought about everything he had learned. A company born from the ashes of war. A structure meant to protect, but corrupted by power. A system that kept Europe alive yet owned it in silence. A network so intertwined with daily life that transparency could unravel society itself. Ian paced across his apartment, torn between responsibility and fear. Truth mattered. Transparency mattered, but so did stability. If exposing the trust triggered a collapse, innocent people would suffer long before any reform could happen. The clock ticked closer to midnight. His finger hovered over the publish button. Reveal the truth and risk global panic. Or bury the truth and let the unseen rulers remain untouched. In that moment, Ian realized something deeper. The world wasn't ready for the truth, but maybe it needed someone who understood both the danger and the necessity of disclosure. Someone who could act not as a destroyer, but as a guardian of transparency. So Ian made his choice. He didn't publish the report. Not yet. Instead, he encrypted it further, created backups, and began planning something far more dangerous and far more important. He would expose the trust. But only when the world was ready to survive knowing it.